The time of World War II was a period of fear, suffering, and death for millions of people. For the majority, the horrors of the Nazi labor camps became an unbearable trial from which there was no escape. While millions perished from hunger, torture, or disease, some managed to survive. Irina Melnikova, a young woman from Eastern Europe, became one of those who survived the unimaginable cruelty of one of the harshest Nazi labor camps. When the war reached her hometown, Irina was just 19 years old. Like many others, she couldn't have understood what she was about to endure. Soon, she was arrested for joining the resistance. Her group had been sabotaging German supplies and helping partisans, but they were caught, and this mistake cost her her freedom. She was taken to a Nazi prison where the conditions were already harsh, but the real trials began when she was transferred to a labor camp. Irina was one of thousands of women sent to work under the most brutal conditions. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, and the guards were as cruel as the conditions they were forced to endure. The journey to the camp was a tormenting ordeal. The women, shackled together, were packed into freight cars, with no room to sit or even lie down. In the crowded trains, there was no space to move. The heat, the lack of food and water, and the exhaustion were unbearable. People fainted and fell to the floor, but no one was given any help. The guards beat anyone who tried to make a move. Fear and desperation gripped Irina, but her mind had one clear thought: to survive no matter what. When the train finally stopped, and Irina, along with the other women, was marched to the platform of the camp, she saw it for the first time. The death camp, where not only prisoners of war, but also civilians and those who resisted the regime were sent. Rows of barracks, mud, cold, and cruel guards watching every step. It was her first glimpse of the nightmare she would now have to endure. There was no turning back. On the first day, they went through a brutal selection. All the women, like the men, were divided into groups based on their age, health, and physical strength. Irina was fortunate. She was young and physically strong, so she was assigned to a labor group. However, this did not mean any relief. The work in the camp was grueling. Long hours, with almost no food or water. The women dug trenches, unloaded heavy crates, and built fortifications. Even the simplest tasks were so hard that most of the women who weren't used to such conditions quickly lost hope. Each day, Irina felt the weight of it all. Fear, exhaustion, sleepless nights. These became part of her daily life. But with each passing day, she grew stronger. She learned how to survive, how to keep moving, and not give up. Despite the despair around her, Irina never lost hope. She knew that if she survived, she would be able to tell the world what had happened. She would survive for those who couldn't. As the weeks passed, Irina began to understand that survival in the camp was not just about physical endurance, but about the strength to withstand the constant mental and emotional torture. The camp was a place where hope was in short supply, and every day felt like a battle against an invisible enemy. The guards were relentless, and the women were subjected to endless labor under the most brutal conditions. The daily routine was grueling. The women were woken before dawn, herded out into the freezing cold, and forced to stand in line for roll call. The cold was unbearable, and many of the women, weakened by the harsh conditions, would collapse from exhaustion. But no matter how weak they were, the guards showed no mercy. Any sign of weakness was punished harshly. Irina was assigned to a work detail that required her to carry heavy loads of bricks and rocks for hours on end. The physical toll was immense. Her hands were raw and blistered, and her back ached from the constant bending and lifting. But she had no choice but to keep going. The guards stood by, watching them like hawks, ready to strike if anyone slowed down or tried to escape. The sound of the whip was never far away. The camp had no medical care, and many of the women suffered from untreated wounds, infections, and diseases. Irina herself had become ill after a few weeks. Her body was weak from malnutrition, and the constant physical strain took its toll. Her skin had become pale and clammy, and she could feel her strength draining away. But despite the pain, she refused to give in. She knew that giving up was not an option. If she allowed herself to surrender, she would never survive. The food situation was dire. The women were given only small portions of bread, which was often moldy, and a thin, watery soup that was more salt water than nourishment. The hunger gnawed at them constantly, a deep, unrelenting ache in their bellies. But no matter how much they begged for more, there was never enough. The guards seemed to take pleasure in watching the women suffer, knowing that they were weak and hungry, yet giving them nothing to ease their pain. Despite the hardships, Irina found small moments of solace. At night, when the women were huddled together in the barracks, they would sometimes share stories of their lives before the war. Irina listened to the tales of the women who had once been teachers, mothers, and daughters. They spoke of the homes they had lost, of the families they feared they would never see again. The stories, though heartbreaking, were a reminder that there was still something worth fighting for. For a brief moment, Irina allowed herself to imagine a world beyond the barbed wire, a world where freedom existed, and where she might one day be reunited with her family. But those moments of respite were fleeting. The next day, the brutal work would begin again. Irina's hands grew more calloused, her body more broken with each passing day, but her resolve remained unshaken. She would survive, she told herself. She had no choice. The thought of death was too frightening to consider. Even when the exhaustion threatened to overcome her, she fought back against it, knowing that to survive, she had to endure. As time went on, the camp seemed to become more and more like a prison of the mind, as much as it was a physical one. The women were forced to live in constant fear of the guards, of the next round of work, of being punished for the smallest mistake. Each day was a test of endurance, both physically and mentally. Irina learned to block out the noise, the cruelty, the desperation of the women around her. She had to. The pain was too much to bear if she allowed herself to think about it constantly. Yet, through it all, she felt a strange sense of determination grow inside her. It was a quiet resolve, an unspoken promise to herself that she would not let this camp break her. She refused to let it take everything from her. If she could make it through, if she could survive, then she would have a story to tell. She would tell the world what had happened here, and she would make sure that the suffering of the innocent women would not be forgotten. The days blurred together, but Irina held on to that single, unshakable belief. She would survive, and as long as she survived, there was a chance that one day she would be free. As the months dragged on, Irina's existence in the camp became a fragile balance between sheer endurance and the constant threat of collapse. Each day seemed to blend into the next, indistinguishable and relentless. The exhaustion and desperation weighed heavily on her, and it often felt as though she was fighting a losing battle. But it was during this period that something shifted within her, a change that would become her driving force to survive. The brutal routine of forced labor, hunger, and exhaustion wore down even the most resilient of the prisoners. The days blended into an endless cycle of pain and suffering. There were mornings when Irina felt like a machine, simply going through the motions of survival, unable to think beyond the next task. The physical toll of the work and the constant hunger were unrelenting. The cold never seemed to leave her bones, and the constant strain on her body made her feel as though she were on the verge of collapse. Yet, despite all of this, she continued. She had to. The fear of punishment, The possibility of death no longer felt as threatening as it once did. What terrified her more was the thought of giving in, of losing her will to survive. It was during one of the hardest days, as they worked under the unrelenting sun, that something changed. There was a moment when Irina felt a glimmer of strength she hadn't felt before. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough to shift her perspective. The women had been working non-stop for hours, and many of them were struggling to keep up. As they moved heavy loads from one side of the camp to another, Irina noticed one of the women in her group, an older woman who had been weak from the beginning, slowing down. She was stumbling, barely able to carry the weight of the load, and her face was pale with exhaustion. Irina had seen it countless times before. Those who couldn't keep up were quickly left behind, punished for their weakness. But this time, something inside her snapped. She couldn't stand by and let it happen again. In that fleeting moment, she made a decision. Instead of turning away, she reached out to the older woman. She helped her with her load, offering a silent act of solidarity. They shared a brief glance, a look that spoke volumes without words, and in that instant, Irina knew something powerful had shifted within her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and her survival meant something beyond just herself. From that moment on, she began to see things differently. The small gestures of kindness between the women offering a piece of bread, helping one another during the work, or even just offering a smile became her anchor. They had all been reduced to mere shadows of their former selves, but they had not lost the essence of what made them human. They had not lost their capacity for compassion, and that gave Irina the strength to continue. She realized that survival wasn't just about holding on to physical strength. It was also about preserving the small parts of humanity that could be easily lost in such a place of suffering. Irina's focus shifted. She began to care more about the women around her, not just about herself. She learned to watch for signs of weakness, not just in herself, but in others. When a fellow prisoner fell behind, struggling to carry the heavy loads, Irina would quietly step in and offer her help. She didn't want any of them to feel abandoned, even though it was clear that survival in the camp often meant standing alone. But helping each other, even in small ways, became a lifeline. It was what kept them tethered to the hope that there was still something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to. Despite the overwhelming hardships, these small acts of resistance became a way of defying the dehumanizing forces of the camp. Every day that Irina endured, every day that she helped someone else, was a quiet rebellion against the despair that threatened to consume them all. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that they were still alive, still capable of hope. As time passed, Irina realized that she had found something more important than mere survival. She had found a reason to keep going, a sense of purpose beyond just making it through the next day. And as long as she could hold on to that, as long as she could keep offering help to those around her, she knew she would survive. She could not let herself break, not when there was still so much to live for, even if it was just the possibility of telling her story someday. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next, but Irina's resolve remained unshaken. She had found the strength to live, not just to survive, and that made all the difference. The camp was still a place of unimaginable cruelty, but in the small acts of kindness between the women, Irina found a glimmer of humanity that kept her going. She knew that, no matter what, she had to hold on to that spark. It was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. As the war dragged on, the conditions in the camp continued to worsen. The prisoners had become mere shadows of their former selves, weak, starving, and broken in body and spirit. But despite all the suffering, Irina held on to the fragile hope that the end of the war might bring a chance for freedom. She had heard whispers of the Allies advancing, and rumors that the Nazis were losing ground. Though these whispers were faint and uncertain, they provided Irina with just enough strength to keep going. Enough to believe that if she could survive just a little longer, the nightmare might soon be over. By the spring of 1944, Irina had learned to adapt in ways she never thought possible. Her body had become accustomed to the endless labor, though it was still difficult to ignore the constant pain and exhaustion. Her strength had diminished, but her will to survive had only grown stronger. She had witnessed so many women fall, those who could no longer endure the physical and mental toll of the camp. But Irina refused to join them. She couldn't. Her resolve had solidified. Every day she survived. Every small victory over the pain and hunger was proof that she still had a chance. One of the darkest moments came in the dead of winter, when the camp underwent a sudden and drastic change. The guards became more unpredictable, more violent, and the women could feel the air shifting. There was a growing sense that something terrible was coming. Many prisoners speculated that the Nazis, desperate to hide the truth of what had happened in the camps, were planning to evacuate them, to move them to another location, or worse, to eliminate them entirely. One night, Irina and the other women were awakened by the loud blare of alarms. The guards rushed through the barracks, shouting orders, rounding up prisoners for some unknown purpose. The chaos was palpable, and for the first time in months, Irina felt a sense of pure fear. It was as if the world she had become accustomed to, however horrific, was suddenly shifting beneath her feet. As they were herded out into the snow-covered yard, Irina overheard one of the guards mutter that the camp was going to be liquidated. It was a chilling thought. Liquidated. In the camp's twisted language, it meant that the prisoners would be killed, that there was no more need for them now that the war was nearing its end. The realization hit Irina like a wave. This was their last chance. If they were going to survive, they had to act now. But the women did not break. They were tired, hungry, and sick. But they had fought too long to give up now. As the guards began to line them up for what seemed like their final journey, a plan began to form in Irina's mind. The fear that had gripped her just moments earlier was now replaced by a cold determination. She knew that if she was ever going to make it out of this hell, this was the moment. The war was coming to an end, and the Nazis, in their desperation to cover up their crimes, might have made a critical mistake. Irina made her way to the front of the line, where the older women were struggling to stand. They were weak, barely able to hold themselves upright. Irina knew that the guards would never waste time on those who couldn't keep up. If she didn't do something, they would be left behind to face whatever fate awaited them. With a swift motion, Irina took the arm of an elderly woman and helped her to her feet. The woman was so frail, she could hardly stand on her own. But Irina held her tightly, refusing to let her fall. It was then that Irina realized something. The fight for survival wasn't just about her. It was about every woman around her. They had all been dragged to the brink of death, but they had not surrendered. They had endured the unimaginable, and in that moment, they were all linked by their shared suffering, by the unspoken bond that had formed between them in the darkest hours of their captivity. When the women were finally marched toward the exit, Irina felt a rush of conflicting emotions. She knew this could be the end, or it could be their salvation. The Nazi guards, exhausted from years of trying to maintain control, were scattered, and the camp was in disarray. For the first time, the prisoners outnumbered their captors, and the chances of escape had never been higher. The night was cold and bitter, the wind howling through the barracks as they were herded through the camp gates. The women didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew they couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving. With each step, Irina felt the weight of the years bearing down on her, on all of them. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment they had fought so hard to survive. The gates were almost within reach, and despite the exhaustion and fear, there was a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, Irina allowed herself to believe that she might make it out of here alive. The Nazis, in their haste, had failed to lock the gates properly. It was a small mistake, but it was enough. Irina saw the opportunity, and without thinking, grabbed the arm of the woman beside her and rushed forward. The others followed, their legs trembling from the cold and the weight of their bodies, but they pressed on, knowing that this might be their only chance. And then, the unimaginable happened. As they reached the gates, the sound of gunfire rang out. The guards, who had been caught off guard by the sudden movement, began to shout and fire their weapons into the night. But the women didn't stop. They ran, ignoring the sound of bullets flying past them, driven by a single, undeniable truth. They were not going to die in this camp. Irina's heart pounded as they reached the edge of the camp, the sound of chaos and gunfire fading behind them. They had made it. Against all odds, they had escaped. The cold night air, once a cruel reminder of their captivity, now felt like freedom. It was a taste of something they had longed for, something they had thought was impossible. In the days that followed, the women were found by advancing Allied forces who had arrived just in time to liberate the remaining prisoners. Irina was among the lucky few who survived the horrors of the camp. And when she was finally freed, she was a shadow of the woman she had once been. Her body was frail, her spirit scarred, but she was alive. And that, after everything, was enough. Irina went on to tell her story to anyone who would listen. She spoke of the brutality, the suffering, and the unimaginable cruelty of the Nazi regime. But she also spoke of hope, the unbreakable strength of the human spirit, the unyielding determination to survive, even in the face of the most horrific odds. Her survival was not just a testament to her own willpower, but to the power of solidarity, of women helping each other even when it seemed there was no hope left. And in telling her story, Irina made sure that the memories of those who didn't survive the women who had been lost in the darkness would never be forgotten.